On 30 September 1979, one Fela Kuti and 60 of his supporters, including members of his family, took a symbolic coffin to Nigeria's head of state, General Obasanjo's headquarters at Dodan Army Barracks. This was because Fela held General Obasanjo responsible for his mother's death. His mother had died a year earlier in 1978, and she had died from injuries she sustained in 1977 when the army razed Fela Kuti's Kalakuta Republic compound and threw her from the second floor of a building. Well, unsurprisingly, this group of protesters at Dodan Barracks, led by Fela Kuti, was set upon and ferociously beaten by soldiers. This bizarre story is one of many that took place in the very eventful life of the music superstar and political activist Fela Kuti. Fela Kuti, who was known worldwide as the king of Afrobeat, produced about 50 albums of politically conscious music that enraged the Nigerian government and defended universal struggles of the working class. His poignant and provocative lyrics criticized the Nigerian government for corruption and human rights abuses. This is the story of Fela Kuti, the Nigerian music superstar and political activist who was really a thorn in the side for the Nigerian government. The man known to history as Olufela Ransome Kuti, later known as Fela Kuti, was born on the 15th of October 1938 in Abeokuta, which is a town 80 kilometers north of Lagos, Nigeria. His family was part of the elite of the Nigerian society, and it was among the few in Abeokuta with a car. In fact, Fela's mother, Chief Funmi Ransome Kuti, was one of the first Nigerian women to drive a car. Fela's father was Reverend Israel Ransome Kuti, and he was the principal of the prestigious Abeokuta Grammar School. The Ransome Kutis were political activists. Both Fela's parents actively opposed British colonial rule in Nigeria. On one occasion, his father, the Reverend, was slashed on the face with a soldier's steel weapon that was attached to the muzzle of a gun. This was all because he refused to remove his hat while walking past the British flag flying at the local army barracks. Fela's mother, Chief Funmi, became the inaugural president of the Abeokuta Women's Union and began a lengthy but ultimately successful campaign to improve the trading rights of market women in Abeokuta. During the 1940s, she also became close friends with Kwame Nkrumah, the inaugural president of Ghana. Years later, Fela Kuti would attribute many of his political ideas to his mother. Fela Kuti attended Abeokuta Grammar School in his early years, where he received music lessons. In 1946, he began learning the piano, encouraged by his father, who believed that studying music was an essential part of a good education. He later received lessons on the trumpet and saxophone. Fela Kuti was occasionally called upon to entertain his parents and their guests at the family piano by the time he was 8 years old. Fela's father, the Reverend Israel Ransome Kuti, died in 1955. In 1958, the young Fela, who was now almost 20 years old, left Abeokuta for London. His parents had hoped he would study to become either a lawyer or a doctor, but Fela was determined to continue with music. His mother reluctantly made peace with his decision. In London, Fela Kuti took the entrance examination for Trinity College of Music, but unfortunately, he failed the music theory paper. However, because he had travelled so far to attend the college, and because of his exceptional talent on the trumpet, the principal of the college allowed him to enroll and resit the theory exam later. The musical training he received at the college accelerated his musical sophistication, thus providing him with easier access to styles that were difficult to obtain back home in Nigeria. During his time in London, Fela Kuti also formed a band, Kula Lobitos. This band played a genre of music called high life, which was a unique fusion of jazz and native African drums and rhythm popular in the 1960s in West Africa. The band would play in clubs popular with London's black community and at private functions. In 1960, Fela Kuti married his first wife, Remy Taylor, with whom he had 3 children, namely Femi, Yemi and Shola. He then graduated from Trinity College in December of 1962 and moved back to Nigeria in 1963. In 1964, Fela Kuti was hired by the Nigerian Broadcasting Corporation (NBC) as a junior producer with special responsibility for music programming. At that time, highlife was a popular music in Nigeria, and Fela did not like this music, preferring jazz instead. Well, in 1965, Fela Kuti was fired from the NBC, who were unhappy with his sidelining of high life in favor of jazz. His music career in Nigeria was also suffering because of his affinity to jazz. Fela confessed that even his own mother, after listening to a performance, advised him to start playing music your people understand, not jazz. Unable to cope with the dwindling fortune of his career, Fela left Nigeria for Ghana in 1967 and thereupon started plotting strategies for a new musical direction. It was there where he christened his new style of music as Afrobeat. This changed his career trajectory, and to this day Fela Kuti is considered to be the king of Afrobeat. But something else would make him much more popular, and this was his use of music as a tool for political activism. The turning point in Fela Kuti's career came in 1969 with the musical tour of the United States at the peak of the Nigerian Civil War. There he met and fell in love with Sandra Smith, also known as Sandra Isidore, a Black Panther and civil rights activist. Sandra Smith introduced Fela to a number of political and musical ideas that broadened his worldview. These ideas had a significant influence on Fela. Sandra Smith also introduced him to the writings of Malcolm X, Angela Davis, Frantz Fanon, and other revolutionary thinkers. In addition to crediting his mother, Chief Funmi, Fela also later credited Sandra Smith with helping inspire his philosophy of Blackism. Because of this encounter, Fela began to think about such large issues about Africa, the world, culture, and identity. This led to his change in musical direction and a further embrace of Pan-Africanism, using Afrobeat music as a weapon of struggle and political emancipation. Sandra Smith can take credit for something else too in Fela Kuti's life. She is the one who affirmed his use of marijuana. Fela had first smoked in London around 1960, but during his time with Sandra, he began to use marijuana daily and continued to do so until the end of his life. Please hold on to this point of marijuana. It is very important for us to come in this story. After the tour of the USA, Fela's music moved away from the feel-good rhythm and spirit and evolved into a new, politically conscious and rebellious genre, which he pioneered on his return to Nigeria.
Our society is underdeveloping because of an alien system on our people now. So there's no music for enjoyment, there's nothing like love. There's something like a struggle for people's existence. So, as an artist, politically, artistically, the whole idea about your environment must be represented in the music, in the arts.
As the themes of his lyrics changed from love to social issues, Fela renamed his band the Africa 70. In 1970, Fela Kuti established a commune where his family and band lived together and where his recording studio was set up. In 1971, he established a nightclub at the Empire Hotel in the mainland area of Lagos, which he called Afrosport, where he would hold regular shows. Fela was soon writing songs about the Nigerian government, which he accused of using the country's vast oil reserves to line the pockets of its moneyed political elite. His shows gradually became a focal point of the growing opposition to the military regime, which started to perceive Fela as a serious threat and used every opportunity to put him behind bars. For us to understand the context surrounding Fela's numerous run-ins with the Nigerian government, we need to understand how Nigeria was like at the time. Nigeria gained independence in 1968, and from 1966 to 1979, the country had 4 different military heads of state, including Generals Yakubu Gowon, Muritala Muhammad, as well as General Olusegun Obasanjo. Nigeria finally returned to civilian rule in 1979. However, the civilian rule only lasted until the end of 1983, when the army again seized control. He also criticized the corruption and breakdown of such basic necessities as electricity, telephones, and transportation in Nigeria. As you can imagine, all of this did not go well with the government. His music also addressed other themes. One of them was what he called colonial mentality, the psychological state of inferiority which he said drove Nigerians to mimic British mannerisms. Because of all of this, Fela Kuti was castigated by the powers that be, and so he was regularly arrested on a variety of charges, most frequently the possession of marijuana. Here's one such notable incident. The story goes like this. It was 1974 and Fela Kuti was about to turn 36. By this point, he was pretty much the biggest musician in Nigeria, maybe even on the African continent. So one night, while he was sitting at home in his compound in Lagos, he heard a knock on the door. It was the police. They had been pestering him on and off for years, arresting him and conducting raids at odd hours. And remember, they definitely were not a fan of his music because of the message it contained. Also, don't forget that Fela smoked a lot of marijuana, so the police figured that they could nab him on a 10-year drug sentence, thus keeping him quiet. According to them, he would no longer be a nuisance to society. So on that eventful evening, the police burst through the door, hoping to find Fela Kuti red-handed. Well, they couldn't find any of his stash because he had already flushed it down the drain. But they had a plan B, and this was to plant a joint on the ground in front of him. The story goes that Fela dived on this joint and swallowed it whole. The police proceeded to arrest him anyway. They took him to Alabon Close Police Headquarters and locked him in a communal cell the prisoners there jokingly called Kalakuta. The police planned on keeping Fela Kuti there until the joint passed when he relieved his bowels. So they waited for 2 straight days, but Fela Kuti didn't relieve himself. He only did so on his 3rd day in custody, but to the police's dismay, there was no trace of marijuana to be found in the stool sample. The story gets more interesting. It is said that Fela Kuti got help from other prisoners in the jail to maneuver this sticky situation. As the legend goes, they taught him to wait until the middle of the night when the guards were sleeping to relieve himself. That's how he was able to clear out his system before the test was conducted. So by the time it got to the 3rd day, the joint had already passed and the police had no choice but to let him go. Some accounts of the story even state that Fela Kuti might have traded his feces with a fellow prisoner, and that's why there were no traces of marijuana found. To show the type of person who Fela Kuti was, a few months later after this whole encounter, he dropped an album and he named it Expensive-ish. As this commune grew, Fela decided to call it Kalakuta Republic after the Kalakuta cell in which he was kept during one of his many arrests. He made it a republic because, as he said, I wanted to identify the ways of myself or someone who didn't agree with that of the Federal Republic of Nigeria, which had been created by the British man. Fela also proclaimed that the compound was an independent and self-governing state. Within a short space of time, the Kalakuta Republic expanded to include neighboring streets. In that creative space, everyone was permitted to do everything they wanted without harassment from the military regime. Fela regularly smoked marijuana and encouraged his followers to do the same. Sex was also frequently discussed and casually had amongst members of the community. Fela Kuti would also go on to abandon Christianity, calling it a relic of colonialism and embracing local traditional religion. The place where he was performing at, Afrosport, started to be known as the Africa Shrine, with Fela Kuti as its chief priest. He soon dropped Ransome from his surname and replaced it with Anikulapo, a Yoruba phrase meaning one who has captured death and put it in his pouch. This was all to convey a sense of invincibility. At that moment, the legendary Fela Anikulapo Kuti was born. By this time, Fela's popularity had reached a new peak. He was also seen as the champion of the poor. On the albums Everything Scatter and Noise for Vandermouth, Fela exposed the lies of Nigerian politicians. He would perform at the Africa Shrine 3 times a week from Friday to Sunday, with the Friday show dubbed the Yabis Night drawing the largest crowds. On Yabis nights, Fela opened the show by mocking himself, mostly the shape and size of his head, and then moved on to mocking his band, the audience, and finally government officials. Over time, the word Yabis came to mean using light-hearted sarcasm to address serious issues within Nigeria. Inevitably, Fela Kuti soon found himself in trouble again with the government. It was now 1977, and Fela Kuti's relationship with the military was as contentious as ever. The straw that broke the camel's back was this song titled Zombie. In this song, he sang about the Nigerian soldiers as being mindless zombies who had no free will and followed orders without hesitation. Well, the soldiers and the army as a whole did not take kindly to this song. In addition, he and his crew had a habit of instigating disputes with them on the street near his house. So now the army decided it had had enough of Fela Kuti and his music and sent about 1,000 soldiers to raid the Kalakuta Republic under the pretext of an anti-drug operation. They broke down the barbed wire fence Fela had built around the perimeter of the compound. The soldiers went on to attack everyone in the compound, and among other outrages, they beat and raped dozens of residents. Fela Kuti's skull was broken and he was arrested, but he was eventually set free. Fela's now 77-year-old mother, Chief Funmi, was visiting him at the time. The soldiers found her on the second floor of his house and threw her out of the window. She died the following year in 1978 from injuries sustained during the assault. The government closed the Africa Shrine, and then later on Fela released an album called Sorrow, Tears and Blood. It was the first release on Fela's newly formed label Kalakuta Records. The title track was written in response to the apartheid South African government's murderous reaction to the Soweto uprising of 1976, but the album sleeve carried a dedication to the victims of the attack on Kalakuta. After the whole Kalakuta fiasco had subsided, Fela Kuti continued living his unconventional lifestyle, famously marrying 27 women in one day. In doing so, Fela said he wanted to demonstrate his belief in traditional African customs and values and their primacy over those promoted by Britain during the years of colonial rule. Equally important, Fela said he wanted to legitimize the status of the women who, because they were living with him but were not married to him, were stigmatized by conservative Nigerians. In 1979, Fela Kuti formed a political party called the Movement of the People to clean up society like a mob. However, he and his political party were banned from contesting Nigeria's presidential election. That year, 1979, he formed a New Africa 70 band and played a comeback concert at the University of Ife. He also defied police opposition and opened a New Africa shrine in Ikeja, Lagos. Now, one of his most controversial moments came on 30 September 1979, which was the one-year anniversary of his mother's death. On this day, Fela loaded a symbolic coffin into the back of a truck, and he and around 60 supporters, including some members of his family, took the coffin outside Nigeria's head of state, General Olusegun Obasanjo's headquarters at Dodan Army Barracks. Dodan Army Barracks was effectively the seat of power in Nigeria. In this incident, Fela Kuti held General Obasanjo, who was due to step down as Nigeria's president the next day, as being responsible for his mother, Chief Funmi's death. And like I alluded to earlier, this party, including Fela himself, were ferociously beaten by its soldiers. After the encounter, he released a song titled Coffin for Head of State, in which he was bashing General Obasanjo and his deputy. Over the years, Fela Kuti continued releasing music that was highly critical of the government and corrupt business people. One such notable song he released is called International Thief Thief, ITT. Now here's the thing. At the time of this release, the name of the song would have been recognized by any Nigerian as the acronym for the company International Telephone and Telegraph, a big telecommunications conglomerate. ITT was accused of making questionable payments of millions of dollars beginning in 1975 and continuing into 1980 in order to gain huge telecommunications contracts within Nigeria. Central to the Nigerian payments was a politically powerful businessman named Chief Moshood Abiola, who some sources said had received large payments from ITT and had distributed some of the funds to Nigerian government officials in order for ITT to get favors within Nigeria. So in this track that Fela Kuti released, he satirically used the acronym ITT to mean International Thief Thief. This song was a 24-minute direct attack on Moshood Abiola and other government officials, and in this case Moshood Abiola also happened to own Decca Records, the record label Fela Kuti was signed to at the time. Fela Kuti was in full battle mode with Decca Records based on the label's refusal to release his albums. And so when the scandal involving International Telephone and Telegraph came out, Fela Kuti couldn't resist and took this opportunity to publicly disgrace Moshood Abiola. According to Fela Kuti, Moshood Abiola had become a stooge for the white man through his general colonial mentality. In the 1980s, the authorities continued to harass Fela Kuti. He was writing hit after hit and speaking truth to power, and in his songs, he frequently criticized the new military head of state, General Muhammadu Buhari, and his right-hand man, Tunde Idiabon. On 4 September 1984, as Fela Kuti was about to board a plane from Lagos to New York to start a United States tour, he was arrested on charges of currency smuggling. His band, the New Africa 70, boarded the plane, believing Fela would be allowed to follow on a later flight. Instead, Fela was held pending trial. In court, Fela explained that he declared the 1,600 pounds found on him on a customs declaration form, but to widespread disbelief, the police said that this form had been lost. Customs officials who offered to testify that Fela Kuti was telling the truth were held in detention and so were unable to appear in court. Because there was no evidence to exonerate him, Fela was sentenced to 5 years in prison. His son Fela Kuti and the band, which was now called the Egypt 80, continued to perform at the New Africa Shrine. Fela Kuti was finally released from prison on 24 April 1986, and his release followed a press statement by Justice Gregory Okoro Idogu, who was the judge at his 1984 trial, stating that he had been pressured by the military regime into giving Fela a disproportionately long sentence. Justice Gregory even visited Fela in prison to apologize. Once released, Fela Kuti held a press conference at the New Africa Shrine announcing that he would revive his Movement of the People Party and run for the presidency. He and the Egypt 80 also played a comeback concert at the National Stadium in Lagos and then left on a United States tour. That same year, 1986, he started writing the project Beast of No Nation, in which he mocked General Buhari for launching a public discipline campaign. The song came not only as a scathing criticism of Buhari's military regime, but it was also in response to the events surrounding his detention and prison experience. His lyrics in this project also attacked the then apartheid South African President P.W. Botha, British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, and the then President of the United States, Ronald Reagan. In the project, Fela Kuti also slammed the United Nations for not taking action to end apartheid in South Africa. The ultimate aim of Beast of No Nation was to expose political figures and global institutions which for Fela Kuti represented repression and oppression. In the latter years, Fela Kuti and the Egypt 80 continued performing mainly at the New Africa Shrine. He also continued with his high-profile campaign for the right to smoke marijuana, as did police harassment of him and the shrine. In 1997, at a nationally televised press conference, Fela Kuti reasserted his right to smoke marijuana. He was then arrested for drug dealing. Fela Kuti had also defied a police order to close the shrine, and so he continued to perform at the club. Around this time, rumors started circulating that he was suffering from an illness for which he was refusing treatment. However, there had been no confirmed statement from Fela Kuti about this speculation. In June of 1997, ill health forced him to cancel a European tour, and in late July, he was admitted to hospital. Fela Kuti died on the 2nd of August 1997. He was 58 years old. The following day, his brother, Olikoye Ransome Kuti, already a prominent AIDS activist and former Minister of Health, announced that Fela Kuti had died from complications related to AIDS. An estimated 150,000 people gathered in the Tafawa Balewa Square to pay their final respects, and over 1 million others lined the route as Fela Kuti's coffin was taken to the shrine for a private ceremony for family and friends. For the legendary Fela Anikulapo Kuti, music was not only a weapon but a means to change the world. He was conscious of this and very much vigorously pursued it with all sense of devotion. Fela Kuti's music has stood the test of time and continues to elicit debate among a wide spectrum of society in Nigeria and in Africa. His legacy lives on.